Hello, everyone. I'm Ricky Sortomme. I wish to extend Margot's very warm welcome to all of you, to her family members, her friends, and David's, and the many colleagues and admirers of David Nadien who have come here today to honor his life and his legacy. David's career reached across three worlds of musical life. First, David was one of the greatest concert violinists of the 20th century. He was, in fact, the last link to the golden age of violinists. When he won the Leventritt competition in 1946 at 20, after just getting out of the Army, the two judges that were on the panel that awarded him the prize were Arturo Toscanini and George Szell. He concertized, performing the virtuoso repertoire impeccably. Maybe he did not have as many performances, as many concerts, as a lot of us would have wished for, but there are numerous recordings that document his amazing gifts. He was concertmaster of the New York Philharmonic from 1966 to 1970, having been appointed by Leonard Bernstein. I'm so pleased today, as a matter of fact, to share with you that Matthew Van Biesen, the president and executive director of the Philharmonic, is with us today. Second, he was very active in the recording studios of New York City. David played concertmaster on countless recordings of film scores, records, and commercials, bringing to them his consummate artistry and high standards. The finest orchestrators and composers always sought him out to lead their sessions because their brilliant work demanded the especially high level of performance that David always manifested. I sat within 5 feet of David in the studios for over 20 years, and I can tell you firsthand on these sessions, he approached the music and he played the violin with the same standard of technical excellence and artistic expressiveness as he would have if he were on stage playing the Kreutzer Sonata or the Glazunov Concerto. Third, he was a dedicated teacher. Many of you might not know that David taught privately and at the Mannes School throughout his entire career. He was able to affect and improve so many violinists because of his own searching for perfection. Even though he was blessed with an incredible natural talent, David was constantly probing his mind and his muscles to reveal the secrets of violin mastery, always in the pursuit of heightening his expressive powers, his phrasing, and his tone. Because he did figure it out, he was able to share this arcane knowledge with countless violinists. During this service, we will hear from 3 distinguished speakers from each of David's musical worlds who will remember him through these prisms of distinct yet intertwined musical disciplines. As well, we will hear from 2 beloved family members, a dear and close family friend, and of course, from Margot. One of these violinists who passed through David's studio is Shannon Lee. I first heard Shannon play 10 years ago when her teacher and my close friend, Jan Sloman, sent me a DVD of her performing the Chanson Poème and the Waxman Fantasy live at 12 years of age. Even at 12, this was very special, extraordinary playing, and the first person I thought to share it with was David. Shannon's mother sent a DVD directly to David that included a handwritten note from Shannon expressing her thanks to Mr. Nadien for taking the time and interest to listen. Even at her tender age, she knew exactly who David was already and what his standing was in the violin world. She continued studying with Jan, concertizing, and at 16 made her first solo recording for Telarc Records of 13 virtuoso short pieces. Upon graduating high school, she came to New York to study at Columbia as a computer science major. That September, she began studying privately with David for what turned into a 4-year cycle, during which time she covered practically the entire violin repertoire. I think it fair to say that this relationship was one of the most important in this young woman's life and one of the most rewarding teaching experiences for David. She is presently studying at Curtis with Arnold Steinhardt and Ida Kavafian, Arnold Steinhardt, from whom you will hear later in this service. Jonathan Feldman, who will be performing with Shannon, and I go all the way back to student days at the Juilliard Prep Division, as it was known then. In addition to being a wonderful pianist, he is one of the warmest and genuinely funniest people I have ever known. Jonathan is one of Carol's and my closest friends. His list of collaborations is too long to share here in its entirety, but in addition to playing recitals with David, he's collaborated with Elmar Oliveira, Gil Shaham, Annie and Ida Kavafian, and Nathan Milstein. He is also a dedicated teacher, being on the faculties of the Music Academy of the West in Santa Barbara, the New England Conservatory of Music, and he is the head of the collaborative piano department at the Juilliard School. Here are Shannon and Jonathan. sure David would be proud after such a moving performance. Vicki Meyer is one of Margot's nieces. Vicki, as did Margot, grew up in Montreal. The closeness of their relationship began when David and Margot would spend time with Vicki on their trips to Canada. At 18, she came to New York to study at Columbia. During that time, the bond between the three of them deepened, and this relationship has continued throughout her entire adult life up to this day. Vicki.
I hope everyone can hear me okay. Good afternoon. You know, over the last few weeks, as I would go through my daily life, thoughts would occur to me about what I wanted to say today. And suddenly the thought popped into my mind, uh-oh, I have to get up in front of maybe 150, 200 people, and I started to feel a little nervous. And I spontaneously thought about what would my Uncle David say to me. And I know that what he would want to say to me would be, don't be afraid and speak from the heart. I don't know if those would be his exact words, but I'm absolutely certain that that would be the sentiment. I grew up in Montreal, and for many years my family would come down to New York to visit Margot and David. And one of the things that we always looked forward to was having dinner together. Margot has very elegant taste and has a beautiful dining room and would serve beautifully. She has a lovely, I don't know if it's a mahogany table. She would have very fine crystal on the table and silver on the table, and it was a lovely experience. And there would be David at the head of the table, and I want to tell you what I remember looking at him at that table. I see a sweet face, a little smile. I see in his eyes a glint of mischievousness, a little impishness, a little provocativeness. I see a quiet and very observant man. I would like to talk to you today about that quiet and subtle man and his many dimensions. As he would sit quietly at the table, here come one of the dimensions. Suddenly David would speak, and somehow he would be channeling a combination of Jack Benny and the Marx Brothers. And it would go something like this. Two women were sitting on an airplane, and one turned to the other and said, "My, what you got there?" And the other woman said, "That's the Plotnik diamond." The other woman said, "The Plotnik diamond?" She said, "Yes, that's the Plotnik diamond. What a beautiful diamond." And the second woman would say, "Yes, but it comes with a cois." "It comes with a cois?" "Yes," she says. "Yes, it comes with a cois, Mr. Plotnik." We can talk later. I have many more. Over the years, having dinner with Margot and David, my family would hear Margot and David arguing over whether David could put the cream container, the plastic container, directly on the table. Margot loved to do things elegantly. She wanted the cream in a silver creamer. And David liked the plastic container right there on the table. And sometimes he would win out, and we would be sitting at this beautiful table with one plastic container right in the middle. And guess what it turns out? David has exquisite aesthetic taste. And Margot and David's home is now filled with beautiful glasses and mugs and other articles that he chose at the auctions that he loved to go to so much, especially in the latter years of his life. Really, I find every time I say to Margot, "This is so beautiful, where did you get it?" she often says to me, "David chose it." My experience of my Uncle David is as someone who was very intuitive about vulnerability in other people. And I think that vulnerability brought out a gentleness in him. He just felt it. So when I came to New York as a young woman, Margot and David were the only people that I knew here. And you can imagine what it was like coming to the Big Apple. I had many crazy and intense experiences. And one of them was that at one point I had a rat in my apartment. When I told Margot and David about this, David was the one who insisted that I stay with them. And this is something I still remember to this day and feel very appreciative of, his protectiveness of me and spontaneously offering his home to me. I know that many here today mourn the passing of a great violinist. I also mourn my uncle's sweet smile, the smile of subtlety. I mourn his gentle humor, and I mourn one of the greatest Yiddish accents I will ever hear. I don't know if he can hear us or see us or be with us in some kind of way. But if he can, if he could, I think he would be pleased to hear what we are doing together. Seeing his sweet face together one more time, listening to him transmit to us through his music the tremendous power of his inner dimensions, and together speaking from the heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicki. As with Jonathan Feldman, my relationship with Jan Sloman goes way back, even further, to junior high school days at Juilliard Prep. He would come up from Charleston, West Virginia for our all-day Saturday Juilliard experience at 122nd and Claremont Avenue. In addition to being an excellent violinist, Jan was always the smartest person I knew back then, and he still is today. When it came time for college, Jan started off at Princeton. Then he left the Ivy League world to attend Curtis. Jan was an associate concertmaster of the Dallas Symphony Orchestra for many years, only retiring from those duties a year ago. He started teaching young violinists in 1990 and started his institute, the Institute for Strings, in Dallas in 1997. He was invited to teach at the Meadowmount School of Music in the summer of 2010. For those of you who might not know, Meadowmount is the summer 8-week violin and cello school in the Adirondacks, created as a practice retreat by Ivan Galamian in the early 1940s. Mr. G, as he was known, was the foremost violin pedagogue of the 20th century. David was one of his very favorite students, and indeed it was at Meadowmount so many years ago that Margot and David met. During his first summer of teaching at Meadowmount, Jan was granted the distinct honor of teaching in Mr. Galamian's studio. I'm very pleased to share with you that Eric Larson, the director of Meadowmount, is with us here today. Jan.
I'm deeply honored to have been asked to speak to you all here today. I've always held in my heart the highest respect, regard, and admiration for those few among us who have reached the pinnacle of our beloved art. It's a small group, to say the least, and while we can all agree that on the names Jascha Heifetz and Nathan Milstein, I would also submit to you that the man whose life and memory we honor here today, David Nadien, was just as clearly one of these great artists. His playing expressed the purity and elegance of purpose, the sound and its magic that, as a kid, brought me to the violin. I was absolutely in awe of the almost impossible beauty of the recordings and performances of his that I heard. What I didn't know, but should have suspected, was that David brought this sense of purpose and focus to his teaching. I had the great good fortune to work with Shannon Lee, the young lady you heard earlier, for about 10 years before she came to New York for college. Eschewing other options, Shannon had the great good fortune of choosing David as her teacher, and she continued to work with him for 4 years. During that time, I saw and heard the impact of his remarkable teaching and energy firsthand. He was never seated during 2-hour lessons, she said, demonstrating flawlessly in his 80s, full of imagination and energy, in the end, really showing Shannon the way to artistry. That Shannon had this kind of influence and direction allows her to understand fully what Ricky called earlier the violin's golden era, an era the violin has not seen before or since, and the golden roots from which it sprung, not only the playing, but also the teaching and thought that constructed it. Thoughts of Dunas, Mr. Galamian and his students, all the way through one of Shannon's current teachers. That kind of lineage is invaluable, and it's assuring to know that Shannon's development continues in her work with Arnold Steinhardt today, with us here today, working with Shannon from his powerful personal and artistic point of view. Yet at this time, I very strongly feel that the sense of our art's lineage, its history of expressive technique, its honest exploration and cultivation of tonal beauty, and above all, the purity of its artistic intent, these things are being challenged. We must insist that the future should not and cannot erase memory. In our art, its history is its excellence. David Nadien was a vital link to the real and the true, a man who lived, played, and taught the violin on his own bedrock principles. His passing leaves a giant void in our world. Now it is a responsibility and duty for all of us to do what we can to make sure that the lessons and traditions David Nadien represented are neither lost nor forgotten. In so doing, we honor and preserve David's artistic memory so that future generations will know and understand this giant of the violin. Thank you. Beautiful.
Thank you, Jan. David and Margot have known David Buckley from the very day he was born. David Buckley's father, Peter, was David Nadien's best friend. Their relationship began when they both attended the Riverdale Country School together as young children. In those days, the Nadiens regarded the Buckleys as family, and David was like a second son to Peter's mother. Since both families lived in New York, they spent much time together, forming a very special and long-lasting bond. The Nadiens spent almost every Christmas day with the Buckleys, and over the years, David Nadien remained extremely close with David Buckley. David.
And Margot, thank you for welcoming me here to say things about David. My daughter Claire would know the term BFF. BFF is a modern term for best friend forever. And I've always thought it was a funny thing, maybe sort of diminishing the value of the term best friend. David, for all of you and for all of us and for everybody, was a great leading light of classical music in the 20th century, and I think it's clear that people who know a great deal more than I do about it know how much his legacy means to the world of classical music, and mostly to the world of people who love transporting beauty, such as we heard earlier today. But he was my father's best friend, and that's a great thing. And that's how I remember him, and that's how I know that they were, harking back to Vicky's words, one of the characteristics that I value in anybody, and certainly valued in David over many years, is the mischievous, impish side. And my father, who was probably 4 to 5 times the physical mass of David, they were quite amazing to be together, because one was a quite large, imposing giant human, and one was a quite small, imposing giant human of a different kind. And to use a musical term, which I probably shouldn't use because I don't know anything about music except that I adore so many different kinds of it, but they would riff on each other. And they batted things back and forth, and they had, I guess the best way to put it is simply a great deal of fun together. And I always knew that they had been naughty together as boys who were the age of my son Connor now. I don't know how old they were when they first met, but I would think probably maybe even preteen or early teenage years. And I remember with great pleasure the story of the large horse and a great deal of X-lax. And that was something that was kind of legendary in my mind. And my father's family had something to do with horses, and that's always been sort of opaque to me. But suffice it to say that the horse didn't do well after that serving. And that's something that strikes me as they're fun together. One of the lovely things for me about my relationship with David, which, as Ricky pointed out, goes back to my birth, because he knew my father for so many years, is that we were able to have a relationship after my father's passing, some in 1997. And David and Margot have come to visit us and have seen my children grow up. We've spent a very secular Christmas together every year for many years. And it's been a really delightful thing for my kids to experience David's sparkle and light and joy. And I only heard him play live once, and that was at my father's memorial. But I've heard him on recording many times. And the transporting joy that you feel when you hear something done with such grace and elegance, and also joy, because I think to do that, to make something that's so beautiful, you have to experience joy in it yourself, is a great and wonderful thing. And the last thing I'd like to say is this. When Vicky talked about the rat in the apartment, I had this vision in my head of David going over with a violin and escorting the rat out a la Pied Piper. And I remember him with great joy and affection. Thank you.
Thank you, David. When Margot asked me a few months ago to be the host for David's memorial service, I immediately felt a great sense of honor and pride. While in my late 20s, I began working in the studios, being hired by David, and in ensuing years, developing a close relationship with him. At that young age, at the beginning of my career, I could never have possibly imagined that my relationship would have grown to the depth that it did with David and Margot, allowing me to don the responsibility of guiding you all through this memorial service. By accepting this great honor, I am able to share with you my feelings about David and also bring to light some of his qualities. David the man, qualities that may not have been obvious or observed. Simply put, David was my hero. It is impossible to put into words exactly why that was, but I hope over the next few minutes, through my remarks, it will become apparent. I'm here today not just to mourn the loss of a great violinist, musician, and man, but to also celebrate with you all that he gave us. I was extremely fortunate to work with him on a daily basis for over 20 years, and during that period of time, I got to know him in ways that most people did not. David was no ordinary mortal, yet at the same time, I came to see that he just enjoyed being a regular guy. In the late 70s, I was looking to buy a violin, and on numerous occasions, when I was going to try one, David might say, "Ricky, can I come along? I'm not working now." Sometimes that would result in us spending the entire afternoon together, driving to Westchester or Queens to test one of the many Panormos I was comparing. Although it was an important and quite serious task, David always told jokes in the car. And as I played these violins, he would implore me to do one thing or the other, with my left hand or my right, instructing me only as David could do. "Ricky, for God's sakes, slap your fingers down with conviction and strength. Do something. Play. Play." You see, even though David had accepted me and even was hiring me, I was still very intimidated by him. I was a kid, and he was this iconic figure, so I was a little afraid to play for him the way I knew I could. I was trying to please him. It was somewhat unnerving, but still, even though David's instructions were intense, they were always in a good-natured fashion. He was trying to get the best out of me, even while only just trying a violin. On other occasions, in between recording sessions and chamber music rehearsals, when Barry Finclair and I would go down to 38th Street and 9th Avenue to Distasi, a wonderful Italian specialty shop, David often asked if he could come. We, of course, would say yes, and then the three of us would end up spending a couple of hours in Distasi, sampling fresh ricotta, various salamis, bread, and other cheeses. David had a ball doing this and always left with a bag of his favorites. There was never any talk of violin or music. No way. Nothing even remotely serious was ever discussed, just fun and laughter while tasting all the delicacies. Speaking of fun and laughter, many of you might also not know how hilariously outspoken David could be, and how he loved spinning jokes from his vast repertoire of humorous yarns. I would like to share with you here only two real-life stories, one of which demonstrates his unbelievable and uncanny ability to play anything at any time with a complete matter-of-fact fashion, and then one which demonstrates his very outspoken wit. We were on a recording session one day that had experienced technical difficulties. No, not on the violin, everybody could play. And we found ourselves sitting around doing nothing for 2 hours. Paul Gershman, a top-notch violinist who was on the session, turned to David at one point during our boredom and said, "David, play something for us." David turned to him and said, "What do you want to hear, Paul?" And without missing a beat, Paul said, "The Erlkönig." Well, for you non-violinists, this work is a fiendishly difficult, unaccompanied adaptation of the Schubert Lied composed by Ernst. I'm sure that very few violinists in this room today have ever dared to study it, let alone perform it. It is that outrageously challenging. Well, I have to admit, David did uncross his legs, he extinguished his cigarette, And then he launched into the Erlkönig, playing it in its entirety, of course, at memory. I don't know what the arranger and the producers in the booth thought was going on, but it must have been a surreal picture. This one lone violinist sitting on his chair, playing furiously, mesmerizing an entire room filled with string players, either standing or sitting transfixed. I chuckle whenever I think of this. At least it wasn't a bow. I chuckle whenever I think of this because it was the very first time I had ever heard the Erlkönig performed live, played live in a commercial recording studio. As Arnold Steinhardt said in his very eloquent testimonial to David in the Musicians Union Allegro article, David had, quote, a jaw-dropping technique. Well, it certainly was on display that day, along with a whole host of other incredible talents. We were all speechless and sat silent for about 15 seconds at its conclusion. Possibly the most memorable moment I ever experienced in the studios is what I will share with you in this second story. We were playing a week of sessions with Plácido Domingo and Itzhak Perlman as they were making the 1990s version of the famous John McCormack and Fritz Kreisler duo's album. Accompanying them was contracted a very fine orchestra with David at its helm. The first 2 days transpired with a lot of frivolity and jokes, much banter flying between Itzhak and David. Itzhak was seated on a small riser practicing the Castelnuovo Tedesco concerto, looking down at the floor where the music was all spread out. It was really very funny because Itzhak actually looked like a country fiddler. He was holding his violin so low down to allow himself to see the music on the floor. He had never performed it before, and he was learning it to play in a concert at Carnegie Hall in a couple of weeks. Well, Wednesday comes, 10:05, Jay Sachs comes over the speaker. He was the producer and engineer. David, Plácido is stuck in traffic. In the interests of time, could you be Plácido in the rundown of None But the Lonely Heart until Plácido gets here? David said, of course, sure, I'll do it. Now, this song has one of Tchaikovsky's most beautiful melodies and one of his most difficult, encompassing huge leaps, hardly whole step by half step intervals, progressing one at a time. At that point, the orchestrator stands up and hands David the music, and as fate would have it, Plácido, aka David, had the first statement of this melody. Barry Finclair and I were sitting directly behind David. When we saw the part, when we saw the music and realized that David was going to go first, that he was going to play the first statement of this great melody in front of Itzhak, we exchanged a glance that needed no words to be uttered. David, playing the first statement of this melody in front of a man who has the kind of career that David was supposed to have had. Would he overplay? Would he force, trying to prove his worth to Itzhak? To show him how it's done. The entire galaxy of possible doubt crept into our minds. I have to say that yes, once again, David did uncross his legs and did extinguish his cigarette. He only glanced briefly at the music, never putting bow to strings, and then the rundown began. David lay back, actually playing a tiny bit behind the beat, slightly slower than the orchestration, never forcing, never overplaying. He simply drew his bow over the strings, producing the most glorious tone and phrasing one could ever imagine. It was a magical moment. He even went up to a high D flat or E flat on the G string during this remarkable demonstration of his sight reading skills. What we then saw happen with Itzhak was amazing. The beauty with which David was playing instantly hit Itzhak, and his posture ever so slowly started to change. Up to that point, he'd just been sitting in his chair, quite relaxed, a little bent over, studying the music on the floor. All of a sudden, his head began to rise up. He regained an arch in his back, and then he locked his violin under his chin, ready to be played. It was as if he were rising to attention. By the time David had finished playing his long phrase, it was time for Itzhak to jump in. It was his turn to wail, and wail he did. As he began to play, it became apparent to all in the room he was a completely different violinist from Monday and Tuesday's sessions. He played wonderfully, and the orchestration ended with an incredible duet, this certainly being the highlight of my years having been spent in the studios. When it was over, there was a wild shuffling of feet from all of us, including Itzhak. We had witnessed, we had been part of something genuinely great and wonderful. Then, for the rest of the morning session and for all of the afternoon session, Itzhak would lean down to David, Castel Nuovo Tedesco music in hand, and said, "David, what would you do here?" David would look, maybe lightly play a few notes, and then give him his fingering or bowing suggestions, which, by the way, Itzhak always seemed to appreciate and take to heart. As the session came to an end at 5 p.m., Itzhak leaned down, shook David's hand, and said, "David, thank you so much for all your help today." David then leaned over to Itzhak, not in sotto voce, and with a teacher-like delivery said, "Itzhak, tomorrow you bring me Bach." It's the truth. Well, we were all undone in full-blown laughter, including Itzhak. What this showed to me was not only that David could be amusing, if not a little biting, but on a much more serious note, in what regard he held himself, the belief in his talent and his abilities. He knew of what he was capable. That was my hero, doing what he did best, playing the violin on the highest artistic and technical levels possible, allowing his violin to do the talking. Whether it was the recording world, the teaching world, or the world of concert artists, everybody wanted David's artistry. I miss him every single day. My path crossed with Jerry Lowenthal in 1980 when he played the Chausson Concerto for piano, violin, and string quartet with David on the L'Ensemble series. I was playing second violin in the quartet with Barry Finclair. I'll never forget our first rehearsal at Jerry's apartment. From the initial notes in our run-through, there was an ease and flow between David and Jerry that carried us all along. The performance a month later was truly glorious. Jerry played with magnificent clarity, creating beautiful colors throughout, and David played with poetry and fire. Since his debut in 1963 with the New York Philharmonic, Jerry has played all over the world as concerto soloist, recitalist, and chamber musician. He teaches at the Juilliard School and still lives in the same apartment where he rehearsed with David in 1980. Jerry has 2 daughters, 3 grandchildren, and a large family of devoted students. Here's Jerry. would seem inadequate after that touching performance. I remember very well Rob Mounsey's arrival on the recording scene in the mid-1970s. We were recording an album in the studios, and this kid, well, he actually is about the same age as I am, appears with his scores and parts. No one had ever seen him before, and from the very first notes of his orchestration, I knew we were in the presence of a special and unique talent. Now, this sounds like probably the correct thing to say while introducing a talented musician, but in Rob's case, it's the truth. He's the real deal. Rob is a master of orchestration. Melodic lines are always taut and clear, large and dense textures, never muddled, and he possesses a set of ears that can ferret out a wrong note from the most complex chord imaginable. Rob justifiably had a meteoric rise, orchestrating from then on for every major recording artist one could list. David had been playing concertmaster for Rob on that first session, and from then on, he became Rob's choice to lead his string sections. The sophistication and style of Rob's orchestrations demanded an artist, a concertmaster of David's abilities, to realize Rob's creations, to transfer them from the score page to the microphone and ultimately to the recording tape.
Composer and arranger, conductor, musician, and so forth at a time when the business was very vibrant and busy, rather unlike today. And in that time, I had the enormous good fortune to do hundreds of sessions with David Nadien, and I owe him so much. I learned so much from him. He had a way of teaching me so much in a very discreet, gentlemanly way. I was a very young, green upstart. I was in my 20s, and so like some of the rest of us, I confess I was a little intimidated by David, and of course all the wonderful musicians around him too, many of whom are here. But he was very, very kind to me. He was always very kind and very appreciative of whatever little bit of work I had managed to bring in. And he, after a session, he would often say to me in that urbane, mellifluous tone that he had, he would say, "Bravo, Rob." And I think he was sincere, and believe me, no compliment has ever meant more to me than a compliment from him. He would often make suggestions about improving the string music in some subtle way, and I'm happy to report that I always took his advice without fail. It was impossible to miss the enormous respect that the musicians had for him. And when he raised his voice a fraction to give a little direction to the section, they would all fall silent and turn their faces to him as one, and it was really something to see. It was inspiring. I often felt like a bit of a fraud as a conductor, especially conducting in the studio. I was kind of a kid right out of school from Boston, where we studied jazz and so forth, and I'm glad that I didn't know about his history with Leonard Bernstein. I probably would have been paralyzed. But at some point, I had the misguided notion that maybe I should use a baton in the studio. I mean, it looks nice, doesn't it? The little white stick, and looks so authoritative. Or maybe you were there. You might have been there. I did it one time.
No, I turned that date down.
You did? Maybe you knew about the baton. I did it one time, and of course, from the corner of my left eye, I see David looking at me with looked like just a little private amusement. And after the session, I discreetly pulled me aside. I said, "Rob," pointed at the baton lying forlornly alone on the podium. I said, "Yes." He said, don't use that. No. That's all he said. I never used it again. I still have it. I think what he was saying was it's extraneous in the studio and a distraction, a bit of an affectation. I don't think he was saying, you're making a terrible mess of it, stop embarrassing yourself. He may have been, but at any rate, I took his advice as always. I need to share one more story that's very important to me, personally. In the late 1980s, I was producing a record for a friend of mine, a wonderful songwriter and singer named Bill Gable. And Bill was in New York from LA. He had a beautiful poetic song called Leaving Venice to the Rain. And we had the idea, maybe a lyrical violin solo would be a beautiful finishing touch for this record. And Bill turned to me and said, who can we get? And of course, I could only think of one name at that moment. But I really felt very shy about calling David, asking him to do it. I held him in such high esteem and hadn't really done anything like that with him or with anyone. But I took a deep breath and dialed the phone and asked him if he would do it. And of course, as always, a complete gentleman, he very graciously accepted. And he said, of course, Rob, I would love to do it. He said, Rob, tell me, what is the address? I can still hear his voice. We were so excited to have him. We set up hours in advance, and he came downtown to the little loft space I had at the time down on 18th Street, came up in the rickety little elevator, and arrived very friendly and smiling, opened his case, glanced at what the notes I had written down for him, which I thought were pretty nice, and we rolled the tape. We still rolled tape in those days. And he played it, and you know what happened next. In his hands, it was heartbreakingly beautiful. It's so much more than some nice notes on paper. He had a way of reminding me what music actually was. You can forget when it turns into a job, but he would remind me. And people have said this so much, I guess, but his sound was so gloriously warm. Even in the highest register, you felt that you could warm your hands on it. It was so beautiful. My friend and I were hypnotized. The song had taken on a whole new depth for us. And we recorded a second take just because we didn't want the session to end so soon. It would have been over in 5 minutes. Both takes were spellbinding. And he said, thank you very much and goodbye. And we said, thank you very much, and he left. And I think the first take is on the record. So I would like to recommend it to you if you care to look for it. You will hear David Nadien playing with an electric guitar. That's probably a pretty rare thing, but it's beautiful, and you can find it, Leaving Venice to the Rain by Bill Gable. It's just another one of many, many moments of beauty that David Nadien left us. Perhaps we often don't appreciate people enough while they're with us. And it's only after they've left us that we realize how wonderful they were. So I'm glad we're taking time today to remember and honor a rare and true gentleman and a rare and true artist. This human life of ours is so brief and so fragile. It can seem confusing and sometimes even meaningless, but when someone appears who can share those moments of real beauty with us, then for me, suddenly it all makes sense. And those moments are very, very precious.
Briefly, I want to share a story about David that Rob told me 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. On F, I thought it was. G flat. On a recording session, and I guess Rob had been up for a couple of days straight. He mentioned this on the recording session we were playing, and we just got to talking about David and, missing him and whatever. And so Rob said that he had been on this session with David, I guess up for a couple of days, and somehow, because it was in the key of G flat, that he said, he wrote a G flat. Now, Rob knows, please, there's no G flat on the violin unless it's scordatura. But he wrote it, so they played it. And he said, I guess after the takes or in between, whatever, David got the part, got his violin, comes over. Rob, you wrote us a G flat. We're not violas. Naomi Ballin is also one of Margot's nieces and grew up in Montreal as well as Toronto. David and Margot would often spend time with Naomi on vacations in Palm Beach, along with Margot's older sister, other siblings, their children, and spouses. Naomi was very, very close to David, and this grew out of a period of 6 years when she lived in New York. Theirs was not only a close relationship, but it was an unusual one. Each encounter was filled with an intense repartee. Fast, funny, and wicked banter flew from one to the other. Apparently, she and David were like comedians, each attempting to top the other. David was well known for his wit and joke-telling ability, but ultimately these qualities gave way to his close affection for Naomi. I believe the same is true for her. Naomi.
Dear Margot, family and friends, colleagues, students, and admirers of David Nadien, I'm very happy to be here. I just wish that I wasn't one of the last speakers because, as my own family has pointed out, these are some very tough acts to follow. So over the next few moments, I'm going to share with you the essence of David through my eyes. I spent memorable years in New York, and I attribute much of that experience to the kindness and warmth exhibited by both David and Margot. I was always welcome in their home, and something I valued and really regarded as a high privilege. But much to their chagrin, I was almost too welcome in their home, for the building staff mistakenly assumed that I was their daughter, and against all protocol, I was waved up to their apartment with no calls in advance. As can often happen, one can be closer to one family member than another, and as a non-blood relative of David's, it could have come to pass that I was merely tolerated. However, this was not the case. Likely out of respect for dear Margot, who he loved so dearly, David gave me a chance. And boy, was I lucky. So David was not an easy man to get to know, but I've lived in a number of countries and I've been exposed to people from different cultures and in different languages, so it makes one a better observer of behavior and conduct. And very, very early, I caught on to David's sense of humor, very dry, and recognized that what David said and what he really meant were not always the same thing. One had to look at that twinkle in his eye, or it was referred to as an impish grin or a mischievous quality, all to say that, to use words used by David Buckley before, how David and his father batted around, so David and I jousted a lot. And for those not in the know, our comments appear to others as two individuals bickering, challenging one another, but we were really having a good time. And we were really outrageous in our remarks, and Margot just laughed and laughed and laughed, and this egged us on further. Having developed a relationship through laughter, this also allowed for more serious discussions, and it was through personal adversity that I learned that David lived by a strict set of principles where fairness and kindness prevailed. He had a strong sense of right, and as I experienced, great loyalty for those he cared for and respected. Although I never heard David perform live, it was very clear to me that music and performance were essential to his very being and his identity. And even though I was not part of his professional world, he shared elements of it with me and with others. Some examples. His music stand, the place where he practiced and always taught, held the place of importance in David and Margot's gracious living room. Another point, David's availability and plans were driven by his teaching schedule, a priority commitment in his life. Then there was his offhand and casual reference to the greats. And then there were the stories that I never tired of hearing, and I'll share with you too. David and World War II. David was drafted and then chose to serve as a radio person in the Army. Early on in his career, early on in his time at war, he ran into a fellow musician who was with the Army Orchestra who asked David what he was doing there, to which David responded, "Welcome to World War II." When asked why he was not in the orchestra, he responded that he didn't think that one could apply for positions in the war. After a short while, David was recruited into the Army Orchestra, and he was asked to meet up on day X in town Y to formally join. And these are the days before cell phones, faxes, internet, smartphones, and that BlackBerry, so communications were not that great. Suffice it to say that it took almost 2 months of constant travel from town to town for David to catch up with the orchestra. The next thing is border crossings. As a musician, David traveled a lot for performance and had at least one violin with him. And as he would go back and forth, he would always be asked, what is his profession? And he would respond that he was a fiddler. Margot would chide him and say, "You should tell people you're a violinist." And as David would tell me this story, he would be rolling his eyes. And after many crossings, and probably because he just wanted Margot not to say that anymore, he succumbed to her wishes and he said, "I am a violinist." And it was on that occasion that David and all of his possessions were mercilessly searched. That was the last time that David called himself a violinist in that setting. I knew David best in his golden years, and I can tell you that David lived life as David wanted to live it. He never complained about his health unless he wanted to avoid subway travel or something else he didn't want to do. But until the very end, David went for frequent walks, attended many estate sales, and gave his all to his students and his wife. He drank a little bit of scotch because he enjoyed it. He always had a great steak prepared for him by Martha, their housekeeper and friend of 33 years. And he had dinner most evenings with Margot, his wife of almost 64 years. And given the appropriate hints, although she never acted upon it, he would have had his niece smuggle in a few Cuban cigars from Canada. These are some of my memories. Margot, thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak today.
My first memories of Arnold Steinhardt were in the early 1960s when I was barely 14 at Meadowmount. Occasionally, he would appear as a returning Grand alumnus, and by the way, always in a really nice car, to visit Meadowmount and Mr. Galamian. We all wondered that maybe he had just come to visit for the day from Marlborough. Since those days, Arnold has burned his name and his violin artistry onto the world stage of classical music. He has many accomplishments, including, like David, having won the Leventritt competition in 1958. But unquestionably, his most enduring legacy will be as first violinist of the Guarneri String Quartet. There were other wonderful quartets that came before, but the Guarneri set a new standard for artistic excellence in the string quartet world. This was due to two important factors. First, each member was an instrumentalist of the highest order. There were no weaknesses in their individual performances. Second, collectively, all four members were fiercely devoted to the art of string quartet playing. This is no ordinary assignment. One doesn't just sit down and rehearse a few times with three other string players and voila, play a wonderful Mozart dissonant. They lived, they breathed the string quartet repertoire during their preparation, and the results spoke for themselves. Arnold.
It's truly an honor for me to be here with you today and to celebrate David Nadien's life. My great loss was to have only heard David Nadien live on one occasion. But it was also my great privilege, and I'm thankful to at least have heard him that once. That was 1960, and in order to avoid the draft in place then, I enlisted in the National Guard and was a soldier on active duty for 6 months. During that time, I learned how to shoot an M1 rifle, but you would not necessarily have wanted to hear me play the violin at that time. I had little time to practice and no access to classical music. But by sheer chance, I was in New York City on furlough during the Naumburg violin competition. And David was one of the 3 finalists. David's performance in Town Hall that day was astonishing. Technically, it was flawless. I believe he played a Vieuxtemps concerto, among other things. The violin is a very difficult instrument, as we all know, and anyone who can play it as well as David can deserves praise, but technical mastery alone becomes an empty thing very quickly. And what I heard from David was so much more than that. His playing was sweet, touching, and yet it made my heart beat a little faster and my palms begin to sweat. It was the way I always imagined in a perfect world the violin should sound, that sound you have in your ear and you almost never hear it really that way. His tone was silken, his vibrato exquisitely balanced and expressive. His sense of rubato, subtle, but never in bad taste, and his overall performance memorable. Especially having just come from Army boot camp, I thought I had arrived in paradise. I'm sad that I never got to know David very well. Our paths almost never crossed. He was a slightly older generation, and also I was in awe of him, of course. We did meet once in front of Zabar's at 80th and Broadway, and we chatted for a while. I found him warm, gentle, modest. In recalling that brief encounter with David, I regret not having the opportunity to get to know him better. But in one sense, I did know him very well. When a musician performs as David did, you know everything essential everything meaningful about that person. Not his taste in food or books, or whether he roots for the Mets or the Yankees, of course, but where he lives and feels on the deepest level. In David's case, I sense that beneath the reserve and quiet exterior of his dwelt a warm, sensitive, and passionate human being. I know that from the phenomenal recordings of his that I've listened to over and over again, from his Tchaikovsky Concerto, the César Franck Sonata, from the Meditation from Thais, and of course from those wonderful Swan Lake solos he did. I mean, I've listened to those, I think, 20 or 30 times, and every time I'm just mesmerized by that sound and that sense of rubato, that gentle sense of rubato, but unerring taste that he had. When someone of David's stature grows older, intentionally or not, he becomes a living bridge between the past and the future. In this age of smartphones and instant communication, David still has one foot firmly planted in a past in which a violinist could take your breath away with his virtuosity, but also move you to tears as a great singer would. I hope young string players will listen to David's recordings and be inspired by the satin in his sound, the shimmering of his vibrato, and the daring in his music making. I certainly am, and for that, David, I thank you.
Thank you, Arnold. Before Margot speaks to you, I wish to thank her again for bestowing upon me this great honor of hosting the memorial service for David. Thank you, dear Margot, for trusting in me. Some here might not know that Margot Nadien was an extremely gifted pianist and composer. When she was 16, she met David at Meadowmount while studying piano with Isabel Vengerova. David, of course, was there studying with Ivan Galamian, and it was during that summer that they fell in love. After getting married, and as David was commencing his career, a life in music showed itself not to be in the future for Margot. Instead, she took the bold and courageous step to embark on a totally new and different life path, a career in psychology. She went back to school, ultimately earning her PhD, and then began a long and highly respected tenure as Professor Margot Nadien at Fordham University, right here in Lincoln Center. Carol and I regard Margot as a treasure to be guarded and let to eternally blossom. We value her friendship as one of the great joys in our adult life. Margot.
I can, for a brief time, maintain the illusion that I'm at least medium size. I want to thank all of you for having come here this afternoon to pay tribute to David. I especially want to thank all those of you who have participated in this memorial celebration, expressing your respect and affection for David through your caring words and music. Let me add a special word of thanks to our wonderful host, Richard Sortomme, known to his friends and colleagues as Ricky. A close friend and colleague of David's, Ricky has played a decisive role in the organizing and shaping of this memorial. So, my very dear Ricky, my most grateful thanks. This service has been very meaningful to me because all of you, David's fellow musicians, students, friends, and family, may recall that aside from witty repartee and the exchanging of jokes, David was reluctant to use words to communicate his feelings. Instead, he conveyed emotion and his love of people and nature through the language of music. In closing, allow me to express once again my heartfelt thanks to all of you for gathering here today to remember David. And now, this memorial will come to a close with David's performance of Elgar's Salut d'amour. He is accompanied by Boris Barere.